Hello everyone, welcome back to my Form 5 ethics class at St. Anselm's Abbey School. Today we're going to take a look at question 6, article 6, where Aquinas tackles fear and how it impacts the voluntary act. Now before we get going, it's important to be very clear on what the question is in this article. Students mess this up every year. Aquinas is asking, are the things that we do through fear when we are afraid, given that we are afraid, are those things voluntary or involuntary? He is not asking, is fear voluntary or involuntary? In their drive to simplify the language of the question, of the article at hand, my students often end up asking the question on the left. That's not the same question at all. We don't really care about the answer to that question right now. We will eventually. We will eventually, at future time in the course, get to the nature of passions, of which fear is one, and how they arise and what exactly they are. But for now, we're only going to take a very basic cut at what fear is, what a passion is. Aquinas is borrowing against the future a little bit here. We don't really care whether it's voluntary or involuntary. What we care about is, given that we are afraid, does an action still come from within? The action that we do while we are afraid, does it still come from within? So here's a little diagram to try to express what we're talking about. This is the same diagram that we use to summarize question 6, article 1. And we could use it really for any of these articles. In question 6, article 5, Aquinas was looking at violence, which is really just asking about, object outside of us. Can extrinsic principles, things outside of us, compel us to do things or to refrain from doing things contrary to our will? Stop us or make us do things? And the answer there is yes, that it's our paradigm case of involuntariness, where a thing makes us do something we don't want to do. And we mean make in a very specific movement of necessity. But we do often talk about people or things making us do things in a broader way as well. And that's what we're going to look at in Articles 6 and 7, and I guess in some ways 8. We're no longer talking about strict compulsion, where I pick you up and throw you out of the room that you want to be in. Now we're going to talk about something more like coercion, or prevailing, scaring, enticing. Those are also, in a common way of speaking, making people do things. And that's what we're going to look at here. Now we're looking at reactions in us. So instead of looking at the objects, let's look at our senses. Can a voluntary act, which normally is first triggered by an object, as we first said back in Article 1, can a voluntary act still happen if we have a strong enough negative reaction in our sense appetite? That's what fear is. It's a strong negative sense reaction. In Article 7, we're going to ask the same question, but of positive S reactions, where we want things, where we desire things at an animal level. Can the system break down here? That's all we need to know for the moment about fear. We don't need to get into all the extra passion details for now. I think that's enough. So with that in mind, we can look at the objections. First objection is pretty simple. He just wants to propose that fear works exactly the same way as violence, that everything we said in Article 5 still applies. It would seem that fear causes involuntariness, simply. For just as violence regards that which is contrary to the will at the time, presently in the Latin, so fear regards a future evil which is repugnant to the will. And evil there just means something you don't like. We don't mean anything deeper at this moment for talking about evils. But violence causes involuntariness simply, and therefore fear also causes involuntariness simply. So as you can see over here on the left, Objector 1 is claiming there's only one difference between fear and violence, and the difference doesn't matter. It's a time difference. Violence means we have something contrary to our will right now, and fear is regarding something contrary to our will in the future. And that time component just doesn't have a direct bearing on the nature of the thing. So the answer to 5 applies here in Article 6 as well. It's a fairly simple objection, and we will look quickly at the reply. Obviously, Aquinas is either going to have to say, well, the time dimension does matter, or he's going to have to identify some other way in which they differ. But this objection does not really factor into the respondeo much, so we need to look ahead at the other objections more carefully. Here's objection 2. And the wording here is a bit strange. I'm just going to read it out and then explain to you why we're skipping it. Further, that which is such of itself, secundum se, more often he'd probably say per se there, remains such, whatever be added to it. Thus, what is hot of itself, as long as it remains, is still hot, whatever be added to it. But that which is done through fear is involuntary in itself, and therefore even with the addition of fear, it is involuntary. We're not going to dwell here because objection 2 can be folded into objection 3, and objection 3 is extremely important. Objector 2 isn't doing anything differently, but it does introduce the idea, which might not be terribly easy to see the first time you read it, of separating the thing that you're doing in a given story where you're afraid. A mugger points a gun at you and asks for money, or in the story that Aquinas uses, the sailors dealing with cargo in a storm, throwing that cargo overboard to not drown. You can separate the thing you're doing, giving up the money, throwing the cargo overboard, from the fact that you're afraid, why you're afraid, the fact that there is fear involved. And then we get into this addition and remaining of itself, and we don't need to worry about that because we're going to do all of that in objection 3. So let's look at this. You have to understand this objection because Aquinas tailors the respondeo directly against it. We really almost don't need to reply to objection 3 because of how much the respondeo directly addresses it here. And it's using one of the most common of all of Aristotle's tools for analysis, the simply versus in a certain respect distinction. You can find it scattered all over the physics and the metaphysics. We're going to use this terminology several times throughout the year studying ethics. We're going to see it again for sure in the next couple of articles and then all the questions into the future. So we need to get it now. If you already know how simply and in a certain respect works, then this objection is not that hard. It's a little hard. But the problem is my students tend to be learning this for the first time, and so we're making a couple of moves at once here. Makes it a little harder. It's also why the objection is long, because the objector does us the nice favor of explaining how simply and in a certain respect work. So let's take a look a little more closely at the first half of the objection and talk about what we mean by simply versus in a certain respect. First of all, I got rid of all of the such words because all of my math-trained students are more comfortable looking at variables than they are at a Latin word like talus, or tale, I guess in the neuter, such a thing. We really just mean any predicate there, but anything you want for X. That which is cool, that which is athletic, that which is fun, whatever, any predicate you like. And we're talking about considering a thing in itself, simply, versus considering a thing under some qualification, limitation, or condition. You could say it in a lot of different ways. The essence of a thing versus restricting to a particular domain. So the actual text, further, that which is such, that which is X, subject to a condition is X in a certain respect, whereas that is X without any condition. What is X without any condition is X simply. And then the example he gives is necessary, in the sense of necessary versus contingent. What is necessary, subject to some condition, is necessary in some respect, but what is necessary absolutely is necessary simply. We can talk about examples when we're in class together, but one way to try to see it, I guess, is, wow, he's a great athlete. Well, do you mean he's a great athlete for an Abbey boy? Or he's just a great athlete without any restriction? Do you mean he's great for a 12-year-old? Do you mean he's highly literate for someone who's only known English for a year? And there's all sorts of ways in which you could limit the predicate or consider the predicate only in respect of some other thing, some further consideration or determination. But you could just mean, no, he's just a great athlete, like subject to nothing. Not with respect to this sport or that sport, but to any sport, to any age, to any time, to any era. Just simply great at X. Maybe that's a helpful example. But we can talk through a few more. Now let's apply it. The objector here is doing the same thing that objector 2 was doing. Forget about the fear stuff and just focus on what you're doing. The sailors in the respondeo story. Sailors are on their way back to shore to sell cargo. There's a storm. The ship is going to sink. For fear of the storm, they throw the cargo overboard so that they won't drown. Well, what the objector wants us to do is focus on what they are doing. Don't worry about the storm and the drowning and the fear of those things. What they're actually doing is throwing the cargo overboard. That's the simple action. Remember, we're looking at simply and in a certain respect. Simply or with some extra condition or consideration. So the simple act is, well, we're going to throw cargo overboard. Or in the story of a mugger, we're just giving all of our money away to somebody. Yeah? We're losing all of our money. That's simply what is happening. And that's what he's capturing over here. What is done through fear is absolutely involuntary. I scare quotes it just to make sure that we're not playing games with how we might mean absolutely. We just mean simply here. It's not voluntary, save under a condition, namely, in order that the evil feared may be avoided. Therefore, that which is done through fear is involuntary simply. I don't want to lose my money. I don't want to lose the cargo. I want to make it back to shore and sell it. And since that's fundamentally, according to the objector, what's happening, that is involuntary. So what is done through fear is involuntary. What the objector is proposing is we have to free the simple action from the story that we're telling. We have to cut it loose. That's actually what absolute means in Latin, right? To be untied from. So we need to let it go. We need to liberate it. Hidden inside this story of sailors are throwing cargo overboard for fear of the storm, we are liberating the simple or absolute action, throwing cargo overboard, highlighted in red. And we're separating it from all these other details, like there's a storm and they're afraid they're going to die. That's just some additional condition. And this is how we get the formula that the objector is giving us. They don't want to throw the cargo overboard, but when you add in this extra condition of the storm and the fear of the storm, okay, they'll do it. And that means that, simply speaking, it's involuntary. They don't want to do it. But in a certain respect, under these circumstances, okay, you can kind of see how it's voluntary because they're really the ones doing it. And that's the objector 3 position. What's wrong with it is a little bit hard to play out. I think this is the single most difficult move in the articles that we read at the beginning of the year. And the respondeo is entirely concerned with clarifying what's wrong with the objector, because the objector's mistake is a little bit funny. The objector is exactly right, but backwards. So we're going to begin with a very easy answer, a very generic, vague answer, which applies equally well to the objector and to what Aquinas is going to say. Things done through fear are of a mixed character. They're partly voluntary and they're partly involuntary. There's something weird about it. In some way it's yes, and in some way it's no. The part that matters is in what way, how, what part. And so you can't write an answer like this on a quiz or a test or a paper. This answer isn't helpful. It's just the starting point. They are of a mixed character. After this, Aquinas does something a little unusual for the Summa. He doesn't often state in the respondeo a view that is wrong and then correct it. But every once in a while, that's what you get, and that's what we have here. He's expressing, again, something like what Objector 3 is expressing. It's a common way of talking or a common way of analyzing, but he's going to correct it. And every year, students struggle, no matter what I give them to read, with the idea that an author could be expressing a position that they are not endorsing, and they're only expressing it so you can understand what they're about to deny about it or what they're going to contradict. That's what's going on here. That which is done through fear, considered in itself, in se, is not voluntary, but it becomes voluntary in casu, in this particular case, in order, namely, to avoid the evil feared. You should be able to recognize that's very, very similar to the way Objector 3 was talking about it. Objector 2 with secundum se and all of that sort of thing. All of these simply and in a certain respect languages, terms are related. Right? But this is wrong. And you know that because he says, but if the matter be considered aright. That's a serious rebuke from Aquinas. You're not doing that one right. If we think about it correctly, such things are voluntary rather than involuntary. And I think one of the reasons students struggle with this article is all we're really doing is moving the prefix in from one phrase to the other. So it's not always easy to see that he's just giving the exact opposite of the answer as the objector and of the previous sentence. It's a simple reversal. Things done through fear are not involuntary simply. They are voluntary simply. They are involuntary only in a certain respect. So we're going to say exactly what the objector says, but in reverse. Question is why? How does objection 3 go wrong? Well, here it is in the very next sentence. Objector 3 wanted to separate some core action and cut it loose from all of the circumstances in which it takes place. And that's the difference between simply and in a certain respect in here. And Aquinas says that's not the right way to apply simply and in a certain respect. A thing is said to be simply insofar as it is in act. But according as it is only in the apprehension, it is not simply, but in a certain respect. If you already know the Aquinas system, if you already know about the two senses of being and whatnot, then it's already really obvious how this reply is going to go. Like this is the aha moment, right? And you can solve the rest of it. But you're learning it for the first time. So what we have here is a really famous way of talking about action and things existing in reality versus in the mind. And that's the better way to apply simply and in a certain respect here. So now let's apply it to the story of fear. There's a lot of words here in the middle of the respondeo, and it is easy to get lost in the wording the first time you go through this. But all we're doing for all that text on the right, now that which is done through fear is in act insofar as it is done, for since acts, etc., all the way down to hence it is that what is done out of fear is essentially voluntary because its principle is within. All of that is just the right way to think about simply in this kind of story. I've summed it up there in that middle expression. The act, insofar as it is in act, the action done through fear, it includes, or actually any action, not just ones done through fear, but action always includes all of the pertinent circumstances. That's the simple act. When you want to talk about the nature of act, the simple act is the real act in the world with all of its pertinent circumstances. We're going to take a closer look at circumstances later in the semester. So we're not going to do a lot with it right now. We'll come back in question 18 to clean up any mistakes we've made with circumstances along the way. We'll leave it a little bit vague right now. But we include all of those when we're talking about the simple act. We want the real action, might be another way you guys would say it. And that which is done through fear is therefore voluntary, in as much as it's here and now. Rather than say throwing cargo overboard as some little gerund is the simple act, Aquinas says no, the simple act is the sailors are throwing cargo overboard because they're afraid of the storm. That's the simple act. That's the whole thing. It's the whole thing. Which means we then have to figure out what we mean by in a certain respect. But if we consider what is done through fear as outside this particular case, meaning we stop thinking about the whole story with the circumstances of we're drowning and we're afraid and all the rest, and we only look at throw cargo overboard, well, it's true. That is repugnant to the will. In that sense, the objector is absolutely right. The problem is that ain't real. You can carve away all the circumstances of an action to find the action, so to speak, hidden at its core, like a pure gerund, right? But that's not finding the simple act. It's not real. It only exists in the mind. If you remember ninth grade, we're actually going back to in intellectio and in re from Anselm's argument, right? When you do this, when you think about throwing cargo overboard, isolated from the circumstances in which you do it, you've created a thing that only exists in the mind. It's an abstraction. It's a hypothetical. Right? And that is the thing considered in a certain respect. Consequently, what is done through fear is involuntary in that respect, meaning outside of the actual circumstances of the case. So the objector has reasoned perfectly, but backwards. The real act, contrasted with the pure gerund, is the right way of thinking about the act simply versus the act in a certain respect. It's a fun move. It's very cool. And it is worth spending some extra time thinking about. But let's move on here. We could actually just go grab the reply to objection 3 now, because it's a very short answer. We've essentially spent all of the respondeo replying to objector 3. That which is done through fear is voluntary without any condition, meaning as it is actually done, but it is involuntary insofar as if we wouldn't do it if such a fear were not threatening. Right? Hypothetically, I wouldn't do it, but really I do. So, as he says, the argument proves the opposite. This is just another way of summing up what we said in the respondeo. Well, that just leaves reply to 1 and reply to 2. And actually, they're similar answers. What is done through fear becomes voluntary because the will is moved toward it, not for its own sake, but on account of something else. That is, in order to avoid an evil which is feared. Here's the key. The conditions of a voluntary act are satisfied if it be done on account of something else voluntary. Because the voluntary is not only what we want for its own sake, as an end, but also what we want for the sake of something else as an end. We've certainly talked about ends before. We're about to spend a lot of time talking about them. What he's introducing at the end here is the distinction between means and end. 2 ways of willing things. Willing something for its own sake, as an end, and willing something to acquire an end, willing it as a means, where the other thing is an end. And both are voluntary. And that's actually what's happening here. The sailors want to live. They want to survive. They throw the cargo overboard for the sake of surviving. And since they will surviving, they will throwing the cargo overboard. This would be another interesting way to approach answering running the respondeo. You could run the respondeo through this kind of thinking instead. It's sort of interesting that he chose the way that he did. The difference between compulsion and fear is that when you're being compelled, you never will the thing that's happening to you, ever. I've only pulled part of the reply to the objection out here. I'm only looking at the key at the center. The direct answer to the objection is, in compulsion, you never will the thing happening to you. It's not just that it's in the present. Whereas in fear, you change your mind. You don't want to lose the cargo when you're sailing home because you want to sell it. And then the storm hits and you're about to die and you want to live. Now you do want to throw the cargo overboard. You want to for the sake of survival. If it were a different circumstance, you wouldn't want to, but you've changed your mind. You could change your mind again, right? You could start to throw the cargo overboard and then the storm stops. And you're like, oh, no, stop, tie it all back up. Don't throw it overboard. Change my mind again. And we'll use this thinking again in Article 7. But this introduction to means and end, we're going to be tackling this directly in question 8, which is what we're going to do after we finish question 6. So it's a great segue. As it turns out, the reply to objection 2 is very similar. So the objection itself is similar to 3, but the reply is similar to 1. A thing is said to be voluntary not only for its own sake, but also for the sake of something else. So things can be relatively voluntary. I can want this more than that. It just becomes a game of would you rather. Not only relative in the sense of the means are relative to the end, but also I would rather have this than that. I would rather lose the cargo than drown. Nothing prevents a thing which was not voluntary in comparison with one thing. I would not rather lose the cargo than keep the cargo. Obviously, I would rather keep it and sell it. I won't lose it. But I would much rather lose the cargo than die. It's involuntary in comparison to one thing. It's voluntary in comparison to another. And that's it. That's actually all we need for this article. If it weren't for the sort of technical and easy to get lost in objection and the simply and in a certain respect thing, the fact that Aquinas is reversing it in a way that students tend to miss, we wouldn't have to spend that much time on it. I think it's pretty intuitive. But there we are. If you have any more questions about it, of course, we'll cover them in class. And you can get a hold of me on Discord or email or message me online. You know how to get a hold of me. Comments down below even. So in the meantime, good luck. God bless. Study hard.